So we'll get started. So hopefully you're all in the right garden room 4. And today we're excited to have Perry Timms here today speaking about teal threads in the tapestry of work. I am very excited to be co-facilitating with Perry today. Perry and I have worked together on numerous projects, and so it feels a little bit like I'm helping my friend out today, which is really nice. So this session will be recorded as well, just to let you know, and will be published. So if anybody would not like to be recorded, please make sure to turn off your video. Perry is going to be talking for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then after that, we' 'll move into questions, building on the stories that Perry has told us so far. So if you've got questions along the way, please do drop them into the Mentimeter and we'll be drawing questions from there. So I'll pop the link in the chat, and without further ado, I will let Perry commence.
Oh, thank you. I feel really privileged that you've chosen me, because the agenda, I just want to be all over it. I want to be on every session. So the fact that you've chosen me over some other sessions, I feel really, really quite heartwarmed by that. I will do slides, and if anybody wants them afterwards, either come to me and I'll send you them if that's the case, or I'm sure Ria's also got that in mind, because the team behind the scenes at Teal around the world are absolutely epic and run an amazing, complex event with comparative ease. I'm sure their sleepless nights probably tell another story. So I identify myself as an HR professional, and I often say to people, don't hold that against me. But my journey into HR has come through change projects and technology and so on. Now, as you can see by the logos at the bottom here, the enterprise I run is a small consulting business. We're 10 years old, hence the logo in the top corner. But we've been pretty enraptured by the whole concept of Teal since Lalou's book in 2014. But my journey goes beyond that, and I first kind of got into this whole sense that there's a different paradigm in work because of Ricardo Semler's book Maverick, and the whole concept of agile and scrum that was starting to permeate through to projects I was involved in, and I see it kind of branching out. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to really, really talk about this whole sense of the tapestry of work. It's like we're constantly weaving new patterns and new formulations into this ever-growing tapestry, and B Corp and climate positive enterprises and living wage as a UK concept that employers can sign up to. We're a 2.5 year standing 4-day working week operating organisation. So we are shortening the work week. We're not compressing it. We're shortening it. We're a World Blue certified freedom centred organisation as well. That's been going for about 20 years. Lots of good friends I've got in that network and admire their take on self-management and democracy in the workplace. And also Semco Style Institute, which is where Lizzie and I first met. And actually it's a real, almost like a kind of coming together of the fact that I've admired Ricardo's work. And now there's a whole group of people trying to help the world turn on its access to something much more self-managed. So just to give you a tiny sense of the work that my organisation does, and it's not an advert for it, but this is how we sort of declare what we do: design, systems thinking, people-powered change. Hearing Jos and Teal Block in the opening talk about what they want to do to create teal neighbourhoods, communities, and even countries got me incredibly inspired and restless, thinking that's the kind of thing I'd really, really love to do. But we're kind of aiming a lot of our work, not directly, but I guess kind of in spirit towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because we all know the crisis the planet's in, economic systems, political misfires, and so on. And we see work as a force for good. We really do. So that's kind of what we do. Now, this hypothesis of mine, I have to thank ChatGPT for the bit of brevity, because I put a really long text string together and thought, I can't put that on screen. That's hideous. So I said to ChatGPT, how can you tidy this hypothesis up for me? And that's what you see in front of you there. So we're almost 10 years on from reinventing organizations, and I'm sensing a few people who are a bit frustrated by the fact that we haven't got teal communities and teal regions and even country kind of concepts, because I think we all saw this as a finally we have a new dawning. And yet if we look around us, particularly recently with the tech companies offloading thousands of people at a whim, Gallup polls telling us engagement is still stubbornly flatlines, and higher levels of stress in the workplace than ever, we kind of think, oh, really, maybe Teal was a false dawn. And it's attracted criticism. It's attracted people who have said the whole concept of things like the evolutionary cyclical theory of human development and spiral dynamics and everything connected to it is a bit hooky non-science. So they're kind of throwing rocks at it a bit. We've all got the chance to kind of critique things that are out there. But the reason I wanted to put this talk together is I'm seeing it differently and I'm sensing it differently. And it's one of those things where, if you're the fish in water and people kind of say, how's the water? You're like, what water? Because you're in it. So there's a couple of things I'm kind of adding into this hypothesis, really, which is, am I spotting teal things because I know about teal things? Or am I genuinely starting to see a turning in that the world of work is adopting much more of the principles of teal, even if they don't label it and they don't actually consciously program perhaps some of their elements to it? So I'm going to talk about two things today: humans, people, and systems. And really, people ask me about my journey into HR and say, oh, you must be a people person. I have to actually correct them a bit, because I'm like, well, of course I am. I think we're all people because we're social beasts, etc. But I'm drawn to HR because of the systems of work that either enable people to flourish or absolutely corrupt and create a really dystopian way of living, which I want to be part of helping override. So people and systems, what I'm going to talk about. And I declare that I am not a qualified psychologist. However, I am an incredibly enthusiastic amateur when it comes to trying to work out how people in groups, how people in communities, how people in systems operate. So I'm going to start with some stuff that you might know. So I won't dive in so deeply because I'm pretty sure you get this. But when we look at self-determination theory from the 90s and Dickie and Ryan's work on autonomy, competence and relatedness, which Dan Pink turned into a bit of a pop culture concept with Drive and his RSA Animate, autonomy, competence and relatedness kind of comes out from that theory and that sort of research piece. But that in itself was a more, shall we say, sort of modernized spin on the work of McClelland in the 50s, who said actually what we see in the human psyche, particularly in collective endeavor, is power, achievement and affiliation. I think some of those words would probably go, they're a bit MBA, they're a bit corporate, and we probably don't like them. But I think the essence of that trio and the 1990s version was pretty similar. And if we look at Teal and the concept of self-management, wholeness and evolutionary purpose, I think we can kind of see how it maps onto that. So I do think there's a link to theories that we ought not be too quick to dismiss. And then you might know this, Ocean, the big five, almost the founding blocks of every psychological and psychometric tool that's in use, whether they're good, bad or indifferent. I think it's well known, isn't it, that all models are wrong, but some are useful, and maybe all psychometrics are wrong, but some are useful. I think there's that kind of, pinch of salt we have to take with this. But when we look at openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and I still have a little kind of reaction to the word neurotic because it's always talked about as a negative thing, but I tend to look at it from the sensitivity side of things. If these five make up the building blocks of our psychology and how we categorize, codify, and understand people's behaviors, acts, deeds, and intent, again, I think there's some strong matching of some of this to the concept of wholeness. When we group these together, this is who I am, this is what I want to be, and this is where I want to be with it. I think there's something in that. So I'm not sure we always make those connections, but I certainly am finding myself perhaps validating and justifying some of the Teal concepts beyond a book and going, actually, it's just a different manifestation of how we look at people together doing things for impact and difference. And those features also come into personality elements, I guess. And this has kind of captured me from a lot of work that people are doing around resilience. I have a reaction to the word resilience either, because I think it's been weaponized a bit. I think people are kind of going, look, it's hard here. If you can't cope, be more resilient. It's like, whoa, hang on a minute. Who said it's all on me? The system is creating compression and oppression, and you're saying I've got to shape up. What about the system? Why can't it let up? Why can't it ease off? But within that system, we've got these three things playing through us and being a part of us. And dispositional traits, I absolutely love the concept of this, because it does start to say nature, nurture, it's not either, it's both. And there are different ways that we can see how we evolve and learn and adapt. So I have a dispositional trait. to want to understand systems, to look right inside the atomic level construct of a system, right to its outer manifestation and its ripple effect and its impact. Nobody taught me that. Nobody gifted me that. That's just something I have within me. And what it's done is it's given me the urge and the stimulation to want to match that energy and that power, I guess, with knowledge and insight and applicable information. So that's where dispositional traits come in. Sounds quite a bit like self-management kind of principles. I am dispositionally oriented towards self-management. Again, nobody's taught me that. I've just found it's me. And then the characteristic adaptations are the things we go, what do I want to do with what I've acquired or what I have, and set yourself some parameters. And I think within that, what we're probably talking about is some of the sense of either wholeness and or evolutionary purpose that kind of comes into play with this. So we set ourselves values and standards, and we heard from Jos and Teal earlier on about Jos's impending retirement at some point in the future, or the fact that the 5 of the family went out to Cuba to talk about something, and everybody went, how can you leave the organization behind? They've set such strong goals and values, they don't need them. I mean, I absolutely love that. But the narrative identity is really important. The stories we tell ourselves and others about us, and others tell about us, which probably does link really strongly to evolutionary purpose and the whole sense of who are we in the story of life. Now, just to give us something perhaps a little bit more recognizable about these traits, we're actors, agents, and authors of our own performance. So we're the actor, and we have a dispositional trait, either Shakespearean classic or slightly contemporary street theatre or something. We kind of like and come alive in certain areas, but we can probably adapt and work across them. Again, there's a whole concept in Teal that doesn't mean to say you completely reject the orthodoxy of hierarchical organizations. You could work in them. It's just not your dispositional trait, perhaps, to be in there. So it takes more energy for you to do that. But you're also the agent. You are also creating adaptations in you and setting a goal to say, I might be dispositionally leaning towards Shakespeare, but I'd love to do a little bit of stand-up comedy. So therefore, I'm going to create goals that gives me the chance to do that. I'd love to see that fusion, by the way. And then we are, of course, the authors. We're setting stories for ourselves all the time. And I think this is the sad thing about organizations who have completely dumbed down their strategy to a series of components and KPIs, when really it's the story that should bring us to life. Now, we've got our personal stories and aligned to our organizational stories. That's when the magic happens. But sadly, that misfires far too much. As I said earlier, the Gallup polls kind of prove that. And then on top of that, we've got the brilliant work of Robert Keegan. Now, Robert Keegan is, again, an advocate for non-hierarchical setups. He's a psychologist who's based out of Harvard and written a couple of great books that you might want to kind of pick up, and Everyone Culture being one of them. And he has these 5 stages of adult development in his adult development theory. And this one particularly is where we find a lot of us. We are the subject of this theory, and therefore what we are is defined by our interpersonal relationships. It's like the community we've got around us, the bench we have, the cliques we form into. Because what we have as almost like acquired concepts is our interests and our sort of self-determination in some respects. But it is all about where am I and who am I with at this stage of our development. So I think there's some evolutionary purpose connection to Teal here that really fits this mold. It's like we come alive with like-minded individuals or with people who share that same potential sort of destination and interest for us. Now, stage 4 and 5 really interest me. So stage 4 is the self-author in mind. And you can probably start to think about you in this frame and others you know in this frame, because you've already got those interpersonal relationships. You're not defined by them. You have them in the nicest non-possessive kind of way. But what you are is authoring your own destiny, and your ideologies come through in who you are. This is where people like Lizzie and I say, we don't work, we are our work. And people might go, that sounds like a workaholic. It's like, it doesn't feel like it. I can guarantee you that. Now, in this stage, this is almost like the peak of self-management in my mind, because you don't need anybody to tell you what to do. You don't need anybody to validate your direction and what you believe in and how you strive to achieve it. So I think this is really what people like Jos and the Buurtzorg team have absolutely got in spades. They are in the self-author in mind. They know the regulatory framework and the connections they operate in, but they absolutely go about it in an ideological sense. Now, this is stage 5. Not many of us will get there. The subject just is. I mean, just the fact there isn't further definition to it kind of fascinates me. It's like, whoa, what does that even mean? But I think because we've got the kind of Dalai Lama kind of achievement going on in this stage of human development, there's a kind of deliberateness to the fact that only a tiny portion of us will probably ever get to this point in time. Because I think this is really where we see ourselves just as not even ourselves. We are just an energy force within an energy force, and we adapt and we can run with all sorts of paradoxes, and we're in constant flux. We're not that bothered about our identity because we just are. Now, that whole sense of wholeness and eudaimonia to me is off the scale, but it's nice to have somewhere to go with it. It really is. So it's not like you've peaked with an ideology. There's still more to come. Now, what these are all telling us is that there are patterns around, and they're often in threes. So if people are kind of going, yes, Teal is a bit of a hooky concept, it's like, I think it's following the patterns of all sorts of other theories about us as people. So Keegan's work I'd recommend. It's been around since about 2009. If you haven't dove into adult development theory, it's currently capturing my attention, and I'm trying to fuse it into talent development within corporate organizations who, let's just say, are trying to sterilize and really homogenize that concept. And they shouldn't. They should be meeting people where they are in their developmental cycle of life and really helping them flourish. So let's see what we can do with a bit more pressure on that. And just in case you wondered, this is what Robert Keegan's like. And this quote, I think, kind of helps us with this wholeness concept particularly, but the whole trilogy, really. Being an adult's not about learning new things and adding to the container of the mind, although I'm absolutely obsessed with adding to my container. It's about changing the way we know and understand the world. I feel really at peace with that kind of statement. So, yeah, I'm loving the thought that there's so much more transformation I'm yet to be aware of and step into. And then just to give us another sense, actually, this is Bruce Daisley's work of late. Now, Bruce was a former VP of HR at Twitter several years ago, so way before the Musk debacle. And he has a lot of kind of chastising comments to talk about from that, because he saw the best of Twitter while he was there. This book, Fortitude, really does talk to me, because it kind of shoots that resilience thing I talked about earlier into pieces. And he says, look, we've been kind of too long pointing the finger at individuals, when actually what we should be looking at is fortitude and the strength we draw from each other. And again, he has 3 elements: control, identity, and community. And to me, they map really nicely to self-management, wholeness, and evolutionary purpose. So it's like, I'm not just looking for this, I don't think. I'm seeing the patterns that are coming from work from people who wouldn't even describe themselves as Teal fans or Teal favourists. So yeah, nice of Bruce to give us that. And then I thought one of the things I always like to do in my keynotes is quote people who are way more clever and able than I'll ever be. So Jal Mater's quote here, I absolutely love. People don't persevere because they're good at perseverance. They persevere because they've got things that are worth investing in. And I think when we hear people like Jos and Teal talk about how Buurtzorg is so worthy of investment, we can see that. If anybody says Teal's just this amorphous concept, it's like, to a lot of people, it's worth investing in, and it gives them a sense of perseverance. So that's enough about systems. And I just wanted to showcase this, because I was a bit frustrated when I looked around the world that there wasn't an infographic that mapped how we've been since the height of the early industrial era right through to now, because there's been so much that's influenced where we are right now today, from Toyota and its total production system, through to the work of Keys, Burker and Cadbury around sociocratic Peace Corps movements, Claire Graves' emergent cyclical theory. I mean, you kind of follow it through. So if you're trying to say to people, if you want to follow the whole history of perhaps where we got to with the whole concept of Teal, it's littered with all sorts of system and people-based additions, I suppose you'd say, and adaptations along the way. And it was interesting that the 80s and the 90s got us into a little bit more of the codification of that with self-managed organizations who didn't just ascribe to certain theories and kind of started to craft their own. So the work of Morning Star and the work of Gore-Tex has captured my imagination in that. But where we look, there are people creating different paradigms, I think, that in their own way are starting to showcase, I think, some of the evolution that I think we're part of. And the picture over on the left is Auguste Comte, who was the philosopher who started to coin the concept of sociocracy back in the 1800s, where he said, look, people aren't mechanistic additions. They've got variable, mood fluctuating, creative thinking souls. And he observed how we come together when the rules aren't quite there. So the signs have been around for quite some time. And then the work of John Husband, who's a Canadian, again, working in the sort of people profession area, who was partly responsible for something called the Hay framework. And if you're like me and you've used the Hay framework, it's not the best moment in our history, but it codified what the market value of people according to sort of salaries would be, with competencies, behaviours, skills and professional vocational qualifications. But he kind of broke out of that himself and said, look, I don't like what I've done. I've kind of codified people down to pounds and shillings and dollars and cents. He said, but actually what I'm seeing is that the nature of trying to stack people in a hierarchy is actually not as natural as we might think, and we've just become conditioned and used to it. And in the early 2000s, he said, look, I'm seeing us break out of the matrix before the matrix was probably a big thing. And so his kind of frame was the concept of the wirarchy over the hierarchy. And I love this sense of connected nodes with no necessary ranking and perhaps situational kind of control and direction setting that goes on in that kind of more random, chaotic, dispersed way of operating. So again, another signal that's around. Some of you might know from, again, the sort of 2015-16 era, the work of Peter Diamandis and Salim Ismail and even Ray Kurzweil at Singularity University, who was starting to codify the sort of rapid growth and hockey stick kind of elevation of some tech startups, particularly. So this was the early days of people like Airbnb and so on. And they started to, again, spot a trend. That there was a kind of paradigm of hierarchical, financially driven, sequential, internal policy-led, risk-averse organizations who suddenly were finding themselves in a difficult situation because the competition didn't play to those rules and set a whole new game plan about asset utilization and utility provision and community-based research and development, and a more transformative way of describing what their business was there to do. So they kind of coined this phrase exponential organizations because of the growth stick on that. Now, whether that's starting to peak and whether we're seeing that actually just become a kind of a blip in the matrix, I don't know. But we are seeing an enormous shift from how people scale an organization and how they create products and services. So I think, again, there was a signal in the system that something's different and may continue to be so. Who knows with Web3 and blockchain and DAOs, whether that's another false dawn or whether that actually could be the way that we're going with technological kind of exchange and smart contracts. But I'll leave that there. Now, but in my country, there's this thing called the Confederation of British Industries. I mean, it sounds like a completely yellow organization, doesn't it? However, even this yellow-based institution has commissioned research and found that purpose-led organizations set with a series of parameters about CSR and employee engagement and humanistic ways of operating are outperforming those who have either a kind of ropey, fake, or even non-stated purpose and are just stacking up the cash for shareholders. So I think there's some kind of warning signs coming from even the establishment that we are potentially in a paradigm shift. So this is, I took with great heart in sort of 2021 when this was produced, kind of right in the midst of the pandemic. But also coupled with this is the work of the Business Roundtable in the US, who a couple of years ago symbolized an enormous departure, metaphorically perhaps and philosophically, from shareholder value being primary to stakeholder value, and that including multiple stakeholders that you're there to serve as a business and create value for. Again, that's kind of wise words, perhaps, and good words, but does it translate into change? Let's see how that goes. But I'm intrigued by this kind of narrative and departure from convention. And even in my world, Corn Ferry, who do recruitment and talent acquisition and test and development kind of support, have really gotten behind this sense that there's a shift in power, that we're talking about mutual prosperity. We are talking about people who want something more than a transactional, money-based existence in their work. So if people like this are picking it up, I'm quite encouraged by it, even if they're not describing Teal, self-management, evolutionary purpose and wholeness in specific words. They're hinting at it and they're playing in that space. And this goes back to 2012, and this is London Business School economist Alex Edmonds, who's currently quite in vogue because he's looking at, again, the whole stakeholder primacy, not shareholder primacy. And his research into CSR revealed some really, really interesting shifts in those organizations that are performing well in terms of market value and capitalization, and also report highly on employee engagement and even happiness at work. He said, look, there's a kind of correlation here. If you look after your people, you actually stack up as a more profitable, sustainable enterprise. So I think there's something in there that we're starting to see equations even come together to support this. So if an economist like Alex, who's got a background in commercial banking, can actually start saying it's all about people and it's all about purpose and it's all about autonomy and it's all about connecting to a wider sense of something, then again, I think the signs are starting to be set out that we're perhaps in more of a paradigm shift than we might give ourselves credit for. And then this is Oxford Said Business School professor. I know it's a lot of dudes at the moment, but we've got a few other figures coming through. But Colin Mayer's research into prosperity as a outcome and an aspiration for organizations has said, look, we don't just look at spreadsheets. We shouldn't. That's just too narrow a view. We've got to think about human, social, natural, intellectual and material value that we're creating as our scorecard. And if I think about how Buurtzorg have been studied in the past, that's exactly what's come through. Yes, there's financial value that Buurtzorg can show their operating costs are no more expensive than traditional healthcare providers in the Netherlands, for example. But the human value is huge because Buurtzorg patients live longer. Buurtzorg patients are not hospitalized as much as other patients. And if they are, it's not for as long. So I think we're now starting to see us break into different measurement paradigms even. So that gives me heart. And then when we talk about leadership, people like Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, Learning Organization Concept several years ago, talk about leadership not as heroic figures and haven't done for some time. It's about the capacity of a human community to shape its future. He's hinting there at more autonomous, self-managed, evolutionary ways of how we should shape the kind of destiny and performance of organizations. So here's where we can introduce at least one standout female figure in Amy Edmondson, whose work on psychological safety, I'm sure, has influenced quite a lot of the well-being agenda in most of the corporate world. But she and Michael Wiley are also agitators for this sense that the hierarchy's kind of had its day as a constant, permanent setup for organizations. There's a kind of bit of a paradox there in that replacing it, the call for and the actuality are perhaps not quite as evident as could be. But I think we're starting to see now that the turbulent world means hierarchies struggle more and more to cope with that volatility and turbulence. And there's more. Because that's also backed up by research from the past from people like Henry Mintzberg. So it's not just something that's a kind of modern phenomena, but I think we're getting academics now who are starting to show more of the evidence trail and perhaps the scientific links between alternative structures, alternative cultural frames that we operate in, and therefore what that means to people individually in their work, that I think talks to a sort of a slightly more impending shift to Teal than we might have given ourselves credit for. And I've lifted these from Lisa Gill's amazing podcast, Leadermorphosis. If you haven't checked that one out, absolutely do. It's probably the premier podcast on my list at the moment, alongside Lizzie's. And we probably all know Gary Hamill, or as some people in the HR world mistakenly thought was Donald Sutherland, the actor. It's not. It's the London Business School professor, often ranked as the #1 business thinker in the world. He's talking about participatory organizations. And again, there's a 3 here: post-bureaucratic, humanistic management and organizational democracy. Sounds a lot like Teal, sounds a lot like the things we've been looking at so far. So we've got lots of people predicting and shaping how we think about coming together to make things work. Now, you might know this organisation because they are the darling of case studies at the moment, particularly from Gary Hamill. They're featured by the Corporate Rebels on their academy. And I like to talk about them because they're an unexpected departure, perhaps for people to think about a Chinese-run business. This is Hire, making white goods and electronics, who operate as an ecosystem and who have, again, set principles in 3: strategy, people, distribution. I mean, that's perhaps not quite exactly what we're looking at, but the word self-management absolutely come in with their micro enterprises. So I won't spend all this time talking about that story. If it's new to you, go find it. It's in all sorts of places, how we dive into this a little bit more deeply. But I wanted to bring in this concept of entropy. Entropy was something that was gifted to me by a director of a company who said, look, we think the best way to do everything is to create a low entropic state. So it's not volatile, it's nicely contained, it's predictable, it's safe. But the world says, do your best, because I'm going to try and create a high entropic state of challenge, different perspectives, unexpected events, black swans, chaos, or whatever you might say. What I love about Hire is that they are matching the high entropic state with their own high entropic state. And actually, it is safer to do so, because if they tried to compress this thing, they'd be just like every other organization on the planet in their competitive world. And they're saying that's not how we want to be. I think they refer to themselves as more as architecting and gardening than they are sort of engineers and so on. So I quite like the natural link to that. But yeah, high randomness and high disorder, it's almost like we're trying to create orderly disorder out of that. So if we zoom back into Claire Graves' work, which thanks to Lalou's book, gave me the opportunity to dive back into it and understand what he was trying to do with the emergent cyclical levels of evolution, there is something still in this about the people and the system. So I guess it kind of talks to my sense, really. And I think if we keep coming back to that, I think there are clues and signs in Graves' work as much as anything that might give us a stronger sense of faith that Teal is potentially the kind of 21st century version of how we navigate through shifting paradigms. It can be complex at times, this stuff, but I keep coming back to it as trying to almost see how prophesizing it was, and largely it stands up. So again, I'm not going to spend all the time going into that, but it's there for us to find and learn from. Now, I also wanted to showcase some of the other people out there doing some great stuff in this space. So this is the team at Semco Style Institute Global, who are building on Ricardo's work, not just as great TED Talks and books, but actually systemic embedded change within organizations. So there's a codification of self-managed practices, evolutionary practices, and kind of wholeness principles within this group of fabulous people that I've started to really, really enjoy working with. And Lizzie and I are kind of jointly helping promote this kind of concept. So yeah, do check out the work of Semco Style Institute. It's another really strong lens of how we could start to see more adoption of the Teal concepts and principles. So where's my faith for this coming from? I'll tell you why. Because I've worked with a number of organizations. I haven't noticed until a bit of a retrospective kind of viewpoint on it, but I'm seeing people use things like Agile as a gentle, stealthy way to kind of unpick some of the hierarchy, control, oppression, and lack of inclusion. So, Agile is a potentially good little sort of Trojan horse within this, or if you like, little experiment, a Trojan mouse. I'm seeing change programs that aren't just starting with the business case and the capital investment and all sorts of horrible Gantt charts that make your eyes bleed, but the concept of emotional change management. How do we feel about this? What does it mean to us? What do we want to do with this change? I quite like the fact we're putting people at the beginning of that process, not at the end as the recipients of some really canned and sterile change principles. I'm seeing people say that teams ought to be able to create their own destiny, their own culture, their own operating sense, and of course align it to a stronger sense of purpose. But I'm seeing that almost in every engagement I'm trying to bring in through client work that's happening right now. Even talent development, as I said earlier, people self-directing their learning, assembling their own pathways, creating squiggly career options. This wasn't things that we talked about 10 years ago. And I wonder how much the kind of concepts of Teal are sort of permeating through some of this and showing us there are alternative ways. I've worked with one city council who absolutely wanted to bust its own silos, much to other people trying to keep it in that sort of sense. They recognised the problems and the challenges and the opportunities for the citizens of this large city were not being served well by constant relay, handoff, lack of accountability. And we created a very different space. So in Eric Ostergaard's words, that was very much a teal dot in a kind of orange world. And only a few days ago, I was with an incredibly long-standing organisation who you would argue would never contemplate Teal. Yet, all the dialogue that came through it, all the systems that are operating, wow, they're centering on purpose, culture, wellness, and autonomy. And this is a heavy regulated engineering environment. A charitable enterprise, really tough on fundraising, really tough operating world, absolutely going for diversity, fluidity, and participatory inclusion and creating domains, not divisions. Absolutely loved what I saw there. A big science-led institute who are putting people through the concept of job crafting and self-directed improvement ventures to create new products and services and adapt to a modern world highly demanding of them. A digital tech enterprise who could just drink the Kool-Aid, but absolutely don't want to. They want to really center on how we can create an open culture that builds the organization to create great breakthrough services. Big financial institution even that has entirely moved to self-managed systems, and people perhaps as customers wouldn't know, wouldn't care, but they probably get a better service as a result of it. And a nice little compact technology agency that's got self-managed, self-set salaries, individual innovation, all sorts of beautiful things coming through. So they're just 10 examples that came to mind when I was starting to put this together. Now, to me, there are teal threads in the tapestry in all of those examples. They may not be the next Buurtzorg, but I don't think they want to be. They just have to sense the evolution that's within them. So these are some of the clients that I work with, and I can pretty much guarantee you that almost every single logo that you see there, part of my brief has a little bit of teal, even if they don't know that when they ask me to come and help them out. So I'm doing my best to get it in by stealth as well. And then just a tiny bit about our organisation, just to give you a sense of what we're doing. We are absolutely living this concept. We are self-managed, we are remote, we are virtual, we are flexible, we are all these things. And we have started to bring artifacts to bear and systems and processes to bear that absolutely support that. We've only got one rule, and that rule is we'll be self-managed. And from that, absolutely everything stems through. So yes, I am the founder, I'm the source, I'm the legal owner. But if you wanted to ask any of my team, do I call all the shots? No. Do I want them to absolutely step in and own things? Yeah, which is why we're creating spin-out ventures, which is why we have all sorts of dispersed ownership through different concepts of how we operate. We have a co-created strategy every year. We have a concept called the Leaderful Circle, where the whole organization, there's only 10 of us, step in and set the strategic direction. So we hold spaces, we have dispositional traits to certain things, but we also have goals, values that we share. And the most important thing for us is us. That's where we frame the whole thing. Now, that's it from me. I've managed to condense that to about 35 minutes, Lizzie. So hopefully there's enough time for questions, and I'll get my mouse working and stop the share there.
Amazing. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Perry. So much food for thought. And it's inspiring to see that, you know, like we said, with the movement that's happening with Teal, that there are ripples going on. It might not be the big revolution that everybody wants right now, but there are those ripples. So do continue to add to your questions, guys. We've got some really juicy questions coming through. So great. I will go to the first one that's been voted. So Perry, can you share a little bit more about how talent development can meet people where they are?
Yeah.
And how does the Keegan stages play out in this context?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really pointed question and right to ask, because that's the kind of lens I'm trying to look through. So I'm currently working with 3 organizations, different size, different sectors. Their challenge is that their talent development is so programmatic and formulaic, and it appeals to the same high potential individuals who, you know, subjectively are put in the top of a 9-box grid, but they recognize they're missing out so much on other people. So what we're trying to do is use that theory to start to frame different conversations, different invitations, different routes, different pathways. Now, what we're starting to realize is that what you don't do is just set a number of different junior, mid-level, senior programs. You don't do that. You create a kind of an open infrastructure. Now, the way we do it at PTHR is inspired by Ricardo Semler's work with Lumiere, the alternative education model, where you have not a curricula, but a mosaic. So what we're trying to do is create a mosaic of the capabilities at an organizational level that people would need to, at some point, acquire in some form of the roles that are operating within that organization. And that they look at both their natural dispositional traits leaning towards some of those as a natural preference, and also those which they've got an interest in, but they might need to learn their way into them to sort of acquire that key competence, recognizing it's a valuable skill and it's an area that they can, I guess, really lean into. So we are trying to create a very informed, deliberate, and well-articulated version of what talent looks like at an individual level to then match it to the organization's needs. Now, the most taxing thing is not even the infrastructure that does that. It's the organization settling on what its future is and what those capabilities then start to look like. So if you know futures thinking as a concept, that's kind of what we're having to run in parallel, which is creating the sense that people are more self-aware about their capabilities and what their intentions are. But at the same time, alongside that, we're saying you're going to have to project into the future to predict as much as you can so that people kind of have a point to go to in that sort of series. And they're not used to that. They're used to almost, a strategy being, are we in adjacent markets or more of the same? And just to kind of cut and paste 2024, they're not used to that. So it's taking them right out of their comfort zone. But I'm also thinking this is what we want from leaders if they hold that space, is to sort of set that compelling direction and that vision of what it is. So, I think that's the challenge that we've got. But nonetheless, what we're not waiting for is for them to just do the vision and then have everything trickle down and cascade from that, because the time will be lost by then. We've got to do it as some kind of almost paradoxical shift between the two. Here's enough of the future. How does that look for you? What you want to do? Oh, here's a bit more, and make it an iterative process. And I think when we're talking about evolutionary purpose, that feels like that's how it is.
Yeah. Would you
Hope that helps.
That's a really good answer, Perry. Would you be able to explain a bit more about that mosaic? Because maybe people are wondering how that looks.
Yeah.
So does that include, for example, an individual's hard skills, soft skills? Would you be able to dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah. So the way we've taken it at PTHR is a little bit like domains or practice areas. So we've got some that are very specific to the HR world, because that's where we operate quite a lot. We've got some that are a bit more around organizational design and change. We've got some that are around organizational performance and that kind of element. But we've also got things like environmental, social and governance, psychology, systems thinking, those kind of things. So we've got about 4 domains that we've mapped our sort of capabilities to. And the way we work it is we have a socialized, like aggregated version of it that people can kind of plot their, I guess you'd say, both existing skill sets and desired skill sets, and also then obviously leave some empty for gaps to explore later. And we start to look within, first of all, that those people who say, I'm really good at, let's say, Scrum coach, other people want to learn that capability. So they then go partner up with that person, and they'll talk about their materials and the kind of way they've learned their way into that. So we're trying to do it really humanist and organic, but that's because we're only 10 people. Now, an organization that's several thousand probably thinks, well, that's not feasible. It's like, well, it is if you kind of break it down into teams and functions and cross-functional projects and environments. I'm seeing learning and development face some real challenges because the whole courses and content is not good enough. It's not timely enough, and it's too time consuming. So I think what the meet people where they are thing is, if people have a real strong sense of what they absolutely need and what they desire to help progress their career, there's a broker conversation, I think, between learning development professionals to say, who can get you this quicker and more in tune with what you're doing? But I think it's more about assignments and real world applications. So that 70-20-10 model that's been talked about for quite some time. People have talked about the 20 and the 10 to death, really, coaching and courses. The 70 bit is like you learn on the job. It's like, what does that mean? What does it even look like? How do I break out of my role to learn something new? So what that's doing is it's expanding the horizons, I guess, for the 70%. And it's largely about that hierarchical network I showed earlier.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was really clear, Perry, and I'm sure people are getting a bit
Thank you.
inspired by that as well.
Great.
So the next question is Teal the right label? And how can we talk about these concepts without scaring people away?
I think that's such a good point, because language is massively important. So within this community, I think we're super comfortable with Teal. And when Jos and Tees de Blok talk about Teal countries, we're like, yeah, we get it. We totally want that. That's exactly how we would want to describe it. But to the rest of the world, it's like, what? So I think there is something about how we can meet people's language frames in a way that isn't scary, but is perhaps stretching enough that they absolutely feel the urge to do so. So I guess one of the things we've got to think about is how geeky are we about it, and how genuine is our desire to not just have a nice clique that I feel part of, but that we want it to proliferate, right? Because if we do want it to proliferate, I think we do have to shift some of the language. We can use it as a kind of asterisk. This is where you find more information about it. So when I'm in organizations that are not at all keen on Teal, or would actually go, oh, it's that hokey Kool-Aid stuff again, I don't use those words. I talk about autonomy and agility and versatility and evolution. And there's a brilliant word that absolutely does cut through all of this. And I saw it in action yesterday with a really big, again, heritage-based organization. When I started talking about the concept of flourishing people, it was literally the word of the day. And I didn't hear it before I dropped it in, but I planted it. And every conversation I overheard about persona mapping for employee experience to reward and recognition stuff, people were saying, we've got to start to think about what we do helps people flourish. Because I think what they saw was the connection, not just to being a virtuous employer, and that's got good draw for talent acquisition. That's how you win. That's how you do great things, because your people flourishing means they're leaning into your organization in a balanced and sustainable way. They're giving everything they've got, but not under an oppressive system that burns them out. They're taking duty of care. They're supporting each other. Now, the other phrase I used yesterday that again worked really well was, we don't spend enough time culture building. And people were like, what do you mean by that? I'm like, well, let's have a look at your work backlog and its tasks and activities and its, emails and ERP system flow. I said, but where's the stuff where you create social cohesion and you understand each other and you support each other and you decompress? And it's not there. So we snatch at culture building work. And I'm saying that's absolutely not good enough. So we need to give people, as part of their role design, tasks that they do, that they can take recognition for and appreciate and build into their backlog, culture building work. Because if you don't build your culture, you just don't perform as well. And I mean, you know that, Lizzie, because that's your bag. But I think we've got to not mechanize culture building or sterilize it, but actually give people license to say this stuff is important. Yeah. I often refer to companies like Barry Waymiller out in the US. I mean, they merge and acquire based on the culture of the company they get, not just the P&L, but is this company the kind of culture that's who we are, which is we're family oriented, as in we want people to have good family lives outside of working for Barry Waymiller. I think that's becoming more pressing. So I'm very happy we drop the Teal label and just keep it as our secret identity, and we lead with things that have more resonance with the places we're going into, because eventually they'll kind of realize and go, oh, look, we're Teal. And then they like it.
Yeah. Use it as our Batman cape, right?
Yeah, like it.
Amazing.
A bit like Fight Club,
Yeah.
The one rule in Fight Club.
We don't talk about it.
Don't talk about Fight Club. Yeah, Teal. Don't talk about Teal, maybe. Yeah.
Amazing. There's a really good question here, Perry, which goes back to you talking about the personality part and how personality aligns. So this question is, what I'm hearing is that various models of personality align with the Teal model of self-management, wholeness, purpose. But do they all support, or does some really conflict or challenge?
I think in the big five in Ocean, that's probably where it's a little bit more sort of tangents and perhaps even a bit of duplicity in some of them, because you could say that, the sort of extroversion element. So I was like, how do you map that into it? Because some people might say that self-management, and I've heard this, requires you to have an extroversion preference, because you've got to vocalize and step in and so on. I'm like, oh, yeah, I mean, I kind of see why you'd say that, because some self-management arenas, let's say, when people come together to make decisions, They do feel like they have to be very active, vocalized elements. But I don't see that. I mean, in our team, let's use that as an example. We recognize introversion. So therefore, we don't just do talking based meetings. We have asynchronous stuff where we record and send it on, and we write things down, and we dive onto a mural board using post-it notes or whatever. So I think there are some things that might have traits that appeal to some of those three things, but actually you've got to go a bit deeper than that. So yeah, I don't want anybody to think it is just a straight matching exercise. I think they're a data point to kind of go, hang on, what does this mean in a self-managed environment? And neuroticism is an interesting one, not just because the word kind of makes me think about the panic type of neuroticism, but the sensitivity, right? I think when we're talking wholeness, there is a real sensitivity at play there. And I heard this again with very traditional organizations who just get behind the mantra, bring yourself to work, they keep saying, right? It's getting a bit hackneyed and a bit easy to say, because what they've got to recognize is some of those vulnerabilities are really delicate. They're really gentle. They need really sensitive handling. And it's easy to say we've got a whistleblower scheme or we've got a mental health first aider. But again, they just feel like perhaps a little bit process heavy. And what you need is a culture that says wherever you need to turn to is where you need to turn to. And you know that people will handle that sensitivity and then will make decisions about what to do with you. I think that's what we need, more of that. So a Teal organization, I think, would demonstrate that in spades, right? Absolutely have that as part of who they are. But you need to work really hard at that. But like I say, it's not a direct mapping exercise. I think it's a data point to explore some of the concepts. And then when we know how people are kind of wired a little bit in terms of behaviors, and of course it's still on a spectrum, it gives us a chance to go, how do we handle that? I've seen so many culture change programs. I mean, that's not even really a thing, is it? That just completely miss the mark because it's just so homogenous. And it's like, that is not how you deal with it. It's such an individual interpretation of it that I think that's where we can really start to explore Teal as concepts from that individual perspective. But we might just find ourselves knowing a little bit more about how to categorize certain ways we communicate and how we engage people. I think it's kind of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. And it's, you know, like we've said earlier about the language use as well, you know, different perceptions of how things come across. It's just not, you know, when you say Teal or self-management to someone, that could mean something completely different to what we know it as. So yeah, being a lot more inclusive, I think, is really important when we're talking about these concepts, and not getting bottled up with the boxing people in personality types.
Yeah.
Tick, you definitely can go into the Teal group. The rest of you,
yeah. I really, really want to reject that, because I think there's absolutely a spectrum on this. And I think perhaps in the early days of my over-enthusiasm for Teal, I was kind of thinking everybody will love this, won't they? Of course they don't, because people sometimes see themselves so displaced from a place of comfort, even if they know it's not quite that good for them. The thought of something they don't know about is more frightening for them. So we do have to be really, really, really individualized about how people step into this kind of space. And the only way you do that, just to back up some of the comments I'm seeing in chat, you've got to surface it all. Culture and shifts of this nature absolutely need narrative, dialogic exchanges in order for you to get where you get to. But even setting that as an aspiration can be quite difficult. You have to kind of work at it. Some people aren't used to being open and sharing that kind of vulnerability. So you've got to create the safety first. So, you know, Amy's right about that. Some of that is in people who are enthusiastic about it, not getting too carried away with it, and kind of bringing it into spaces where people can feel your energy for it, but appreciate their sort of space on that spectrum.
Yeah, definitely. So the next question, Perry, is again around the stages. So how is the stage of self-authoring, self-transforming assessed?
Really good question, because I think I'm yet to discover how Keegan really sort of gives us a really tight frame to do that. So I think there's a little bit of the emotional intelligence, self-awareness kind of journey stuff we might recognize, that people kind of go, am I that, or do I just aspire to that? Before I sort of give you what I think my sense of that is, I'll talk to you about Carol Dweck's growth mindset and fixed mindset stuff. Now, I don't deny it. I don't dislike it, but what I see is people who would self-report as growth mindset because that's what you should do. It feels like the right thing to do. And I'm like, but is that really you? Or is that a story you're telling yourself just to sort of position yourself in a place of non-social stigma, right? So I think there's some of this where people might identify themselves as something, but you're kind of looking at them going, are you sure? Because I'm not seeing the way you do that. Now, I got asked this question yesterday by somebody who really, really wanted to know how they could kind of self-improve. And my solution was, you've got to get somebody to work with you on this who will observe you almost anthropologically in interactions, in meeting environments, intense decision-making scenarios, whatever it is. Because I don't think we can just rely on ourselves to do that unless you are in the transforming mind and you're the Dalai Lama, right? I don't think we can rely on ourselves too much there. So I think we need some external perspective. Now, they don't have to be an expert. They just narrate back how you are, and you have to deal with that, I think. So I think we can pair up and we can go, look out for me. How am I? And then let me know, because I want to use that information to understand whether my version of me and what you see of me is something I can test further and even get some coaching or whatever it might be. So I think it's less about, can I fill in a psychometric test, and more about, can people observe me in the real world and just give me some data points that I won't have because I'm me, and I'll probably convince myself that I'm not that. So that's one way of doing it. Now, there's an extreme example of it that Lisa Gill told me about one time, actually. In Italy, apparently there's this concept called social clowning. A group of people in a corporate environment will be observed by somebody who has clowning kind of skills and techniques, right? Who observe all the behaviors, and then they play the behaviors back to them as a kind of parody sketch. So the corporates go, what, we're like that and we do that? So I think there is something about how you can use those kind of reflective inputs. And I know I've sat in meetings and observed people and given them feedback, and people are like, I have no idea I shut everybody down. It's like, yeah, you do. So I think there are some things here that we can do that are observable, witnessable, evidential kind of facts, but we need help in it. There probably are some psychometric tests that gives us, again, some data points, but I don't want to go down that route. I'd rather it be more naturally observed and fed back and self-aware and self-determined shifts within that. Do I think I'm in the self-authoring mind? A little bit, because I'm definitely living an ideology, but I totally recognise myself still in the socialised mind. So I think I'm flitting between the two for sure. And I'm probably even further back sometimes in the imperialistic mind when I'm a bit huffy and I haven't got my own way.
I know many founders who'll be able to relate to that, Perry. Amazing. So sticking on that theme of these stages, how do you identify stage 2 and stage 3 in real workplace examples? And then how do you work with stage 2 and 3 to grow? And, you know, the person has said that there's lots of ego around, which doesn't contribute to the whole. So how can we move things forward?
I think the clues are in the kind of how you are and what you have. So I think, you know, having some goals and values is a great way of kind of going, yeah, I feel really comfortable with those. And how much you define yourself then with the people around you as the sort of determinant of validating who you are and what you stand for. Whereas if you can feel yourself being a bit contrary even to those people, because you've sort of developed a very strong ideology, which is almost like, I kind of thought those people would be with me, but maybe my ideology is not quite what they think it is. Do I validate myself by them, or do I validate myself by that ideology? So you become a little bit detached from the presencing of others being with you, and you are much more comfortable being with the ideology. That's a very strong test that I've been trying to apply to myself quite a bit. And you know, so if I go back about 10 years, I would have identified myself entirely with a group of HR practitioners who were a little bit rebellious, lots of social networking, blogged a lot, you know, did unconferences and all that kind of stuff. I don't associate myself with that anymore. That time I was very socialized mind. Now I've got an ideology they wouldn't subscribe to. So I'm kind of thinking in that respect, there's a bit more of the self-authoring mind going on there, because I don't define myself by that. But I've had some hard yards trying to think, why don't I connect with those people anymore? Why do they not understand me and actually even dislike me now? So I think there's some departures and fissures and cracks and all that kind of stuff that we perhaps haven't explained before. This gave me a chance to explain it. It's like, in that respect, I'm more self-authorizing than socialized. I've had to become comfortable with that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for such a vulnerable answer, Perry. Really interesting.
Cool.
So it's coming close to the end of the session now,
Wow.
which I can't believe it's gone so quickly.
I
So
know.
we'll be continuing the chat and consolidating our learnings in the spatial chat. So we're going to be in Nature's Garden after this session, and I'm going to post the link in the chat. So if you'd like to continue this conversation or come and meet me, I'll be there. I don't know whether, Perry, are you joining us for a bit of
Oh, yeah.
short time? Perfect. So we'll both be in the spatial chat, and look forward to seeing you all in there. Thank you so
Yay.
much
Thanks,
for joining
everybody.
us.
Hope that was
Thank
useful.
you. Bye.